Panya is going to talk to us today because for many years she has been preserving the heritage of Black culture in Nottingham. That's groups that use print culture and it's activist groups who made a difference in the city in decades gone by, as Panya does now, and as many other people do now. But she's really a kind of keeper of the history and she's preserving it. One recent accolade, only 2 weeks ago, I believe, you may have seen it on the television news. Panya was one of 100 heroes whose faces were cast onto Nottingham Castle, a celebration to preempt its imminent reopening. And she was there because of her contribution to heritage and culture and art and activism. Not only was her face cast onto the castle, but one of her poems too. So in the company of others like, well, B.H. Lawrence or snippets from Alan Sillitoe. So she was in good company over the last 100 years, 100 people for 100 years. So Panya, without further ado, it's really your print culture expertise that you're going to talk to us all about today. And you will get a sense of Nottingham Black Archive's work through what Panya tells us. Thank you, Panya.
Thank you, Sharon. What can I say? I usually don't like long introductions because it makes me go bashful. Yeah, so thank you for that. And yes, so I'm going to talk to you about Nottingham Archive. I'm going to talk about how it came into being, why it came into being, and share with you some of its collection. And then there'll be the opportunity for you to ask me some questions at the end. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this. I should say as well that I've got some images in my slideshow that they're photographs that I took of the Black Lives Matter protest that happened at the Forest last year after the murder of George Floyd. So I thought I'd add those into the proceedings. So next slide, please. Thank you. So very much like Sharon said, I'm a poet activist and have always been, my poetry has always been political. That doesn't mean I don't write about love and things like that, but the mainstay of my work is political. And my PhD, I am writing political poetry too. I'm an archivist as well. I did an MA in Museum Studies in 2007 at Leicester, and that's kind of what got me on the road to archiving. And as Sharon said, I am a PhD candidate. My PhD is looking at Black political poetry in Nottingham from the 1970s to the 1980s. And so I've just been mining the people in Nottingham who have been writing political poetry and specifically looking at Black print culture for the poetry. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, why a Black archive? And I think it's important to spend some time talking about why a Black archive, because then I guess it will make sense of what the archive holds within it. Next slide, please. Thank you. I could end my presentation here. Why a Black archive? Because Black Lives Matter. But I won't, because that's not the thing to do. You can see on that photograph that I took there, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I guess that sums up why the archive began. I was sick and tired of asking the mainstream heritage sector to represent my culture and my history in a meaningful way. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look at Nottingham, because, you know, maybe you might be thinking, well, why? You know, there's not that many Black people in the city. These are stats from the 2011 census, so they're slightly out of date. 65.5, around that percentage of the population is white, which means that the third of the population are from other ethnic groups. So one in three people in Nottingham are from a different ethnic group. You can see the breakdown there of the African Caribbean group, because Nottingham Black Archive is about African Caribbean people. It doesn't include South Asians or any other ethnic minorities. So you can see the breakdown there: 3.2% African, 2.1% Caribbean. In Nottingham, we have the largest mixed race population outside of London in any city. So I think there's enough of us here in the city, with it being a third of ethnic minorities, for our history to be represented. And in a way, I don't think I really need to, I shouldn't really have to justify that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as part of my research, I've been mining the African Caribbean community who came to Nottingham during the Windrush period. And one of the quotes I found, which was in the Evening Post in 1954, was it was from an article that was interviewing a number of West African men who were in a hostel. And the interviewer asked them, you know, what they felt about Nottingham. And they said that of all cities and towns of Britain, the people of Nottingham are most hostile towards them. That's what they said. So this cultivation of a hostile environment is not unique to Nottingham, because it happened throughout the country, but it certainly was here in Nottingham too. And I know that we like to believe that Nottingham is a city that we can all be proud of. That's our motto, but there are some murky secrets within our city. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here is another extract from an article in the Evening Post. Do I need to read it for you? I'm sure you can read it yourselves. Okay, I'll read it for you. So this was an article talking about Black people in Nottingham and the colour bar, and it shows you how the media was involved in cultivating that hostile environment. So they say here, what happens when a coloured landlord takes over the house next door? Do you, no, actually I won't read it. And the reason why I won't read it is because the slide is very small. I haven't really got great eyesight, and I'm sure you're all able to read that yourselves. So I'm going to give you a second just to read that extract and to see how the hostile environment was being cultivated in Nottingham. Okay, hopefully you're quick readers. I like the bit about, do we want a Harlem in our midst? So it's this kind of propaganda that people from the Caribbean were experiencing when they settled here in Nottingham. Next slide, please. Thank you. When I was studying my MA in Museum Studies, one of the people whose work I really loved the most was a scholar called Richard Sandel. And he wrote a book called Museums. Well, he was one of the editors of a book called Museum Society Equality. And he said, it has been said that the social impact of museums can be related to the formation of cultural identity, and that it can create a sense of place and belonging. It can also, if it is argued, propagate the suppression of minorities, whether that is on the grounds of race, sexuality, or ability. So he was showing, he was talking about how important it is for museums and galleries and heritage organizations to represent all people, and the impact of not representing people and how that can have a detrimental effect on how an individual constructs their identity. Next slide, please. Thank you. He also went on to say, for the excluded, whether they be so for reasons of poverty, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, or most often some combination of these, the situation in society can generate a lack of confidence, a sense of not belonging, which makes supposed opportunities seem unattainable. So, you know, it has a big impact upon people, just like schools and educations. Museums and galleries play a central role in individuals' lives. And, you know, most children will have experienced a museum or a gallery as part of the curriculum. And if what they are experiencing is something that doesn't represent them in a particular way, then it can make them feel as though they can't achieve or that they're not worth as much as their white counterparts. Next slide, please. Thank you. As part of my MA, I did some research. My research was researching the attitudes and perceptions of the African Caribbean community to museums and galleries, specifically within Nottingham. And I spoke to a number of young people, to groups, to organisations, to the front of house staff at Nottingham Castle, to the service manager, to the engagement officer. I spoke to everyone that would speak to me. And I'm just going to share a few slides of some of the things that the young people said to me about Nottingham Museum Service. So one young person said, I don't think it caters to Black people. Definitely not. I'd say just for white people, basically. So this is someone who's missing out on all the wonderful things engaging with history can do for you. I've been watching behind the scenes at the museum. It's behind the scenes at the V&A, and they've been talking to different museums professionals, the conservators and so on. And one of the professionals said, you know, just handling an object from the past, the feeling that generates, you know, that generated in him, it made him feel wonderful. So here we have a group of people that are not having the opportunity to engage, handle, or see artifacts that represent them or have a meaning to them. So they're being denied the opportunity to feel wonderful, to feel good, to feel great. Next slide, please. This is another young person. He said, I just don't see it. For me, it doesn't seem to contain anything relevant to me. So again, this was talking specifically about Nottingham museums. He said, most of the museums I visited, the only thing that seems relevant to me is slavery. And I just don't feel that like they showcase some of the good in my history other than that one big problem. So when I talk about why Nottingham Black Archive, this was one of my bugbears. When there was a heritage project, it was always centered around slavery. And there's more to Black history than slavery. There's absolutely more to Black history than slavery. And this is some of the things that the young people themselves were saying. Next slide, please. So this was a group leader that I spoke to, and he said, if you have security guards, and what he was talking about here was the front of house staff, he said, if you have security guards following you around, then you are being given a message. And if you are being confronted with that before you even get in the building, then do you want to take the next step? And that is the kind of environment that people from the African Caribbean community faced when they visited any of the heritage organisations here in Nottingham during the 2007-2009 period when I was doing my MA, and prior to that. And we'll see what the future holds with the relaunching of the castle. I also witnessed a number of injustices myself. I was working at the castle at this phase as a freelance worker, freelance outreach worker, and there was a number of times when I had to step in and deal with a situation. So this kind of environment means that Black people, basically, they don't want to go and visit heritage sites. They don't, you know, why should you if you're being targeted and made to feel like a criminal? Next slide, please. Thank you. Another reason why I decided to do the archive is what have you done for us? Why are you here? And so this is a quote from Michael Forbes. He's a visual artist. And this was a project that I did with Sharon. It was an AHRC project looking at the World War I veterans in Nottingham, trying to mine who they were or descendants of them. And he said, I think people are just not accepting that there's been a wider contribution to defending Britain and freedom. So when you hear that kind of narrative, my parents fought for this country, and you think to yourself, well, a great number of our parents and grandparents fought for the defense of freedom. So reasons like this, why there is a Nottingham Black Archive. Next slide, please. Thank you. We fought in World War I. There was the British West Indian Regiment, which was a volunteer regiment. So people from the Caribbean fought in the First World War, and they weren't paid to do it. They were treated horrendously. They were not given the adequate equipment or uniform. They suffered terribly, but we contributed. We contributed to World War I. Next slide, please. We also contributed to World War II. And many of the servicemen who fought in World War II, you could say they were children. The man pictured there is Oswald George Powell, 17 years old when he fought in the Second World War, 17. He lied about his age so that he could enlist. And the image where you can see the men walking through the Nottingham Market Square, that's an example of activism. They were marching in the Market Square because they were not being recognised when it came to commemorative events around the wars. And so they marched through the Market Square, they marched up Mansfield Road, they marched down to the Forest Recreation Ground to let people see them and know that they had contributed, they had fought in World War II. They had defended this country. Next slide, please. Why? Because there is a long Black presence in Nottingham. And I'm just giving you two examples here. 1784, George John Scipio Africanus, businessman and entrepreneur, buried in St. Mary's Church in the Lace Market. 1873, Susie and Chuma, who travelled to Newstead Abbey to meet the Webb family, who were the guides of Dr. David Livingstone. This is all part of Nottinghamshire's history that goes untold. Next slide, please. Here's another quote that came from the AHRC project, and this is from Jagdish Patel, and he's a photographer. He said, people don't acknowledge that there isn't such a thing as white Britain. It has always been interconnected with other parts of the world. And the reason people think it's only white Britain is because that's the way they have been taught. They are victims of the state just as much as we have been victims of the state. And I really like that quote, because prior to that, I always thought that I was the only victim in this, that the fact that my history wasn't being told made me the victim, until I realized that actually all the people who don't know about Black history themselves are also victims. And so museums and galleries, education authorities, they all have a responsibility to tell the whole of history. Next slide, please. This is a quote from Nottingham Castle Museums and Galleries service manager. He was one of the people I interviewed as part of this. And I guess this was sort of, for me, the straw that broke the camel's back. So he said a lot of professionally qualified BME people with a museum background tend to be in London and Birmingham. There's this migration to larger cities. There's also an even older tradition where the front of house teams were recruited from people who tended to be retired and tended to be white male and from a certain background. And that certain background they were ex-policemen. So when we go back a few slides, don't move the slides, I'm just saying this. When we go back a few slides and we hear the young black men saying they're being followed around by as they call them, the security guards. What they're being followed around by is ex-policemen. So that there is that tradition that the front of house team were recruited from ex-policemen. But that also, that myth that museums professionals migrate to other cities is untrue. We have museums professionals here. They just can't get a job. Next slide, please. I did say I wasn't going to be too political, so just hang on, I'm just going to rein myself in a bit. So why is there a Nottingham Black Archive? To tell our story. That's why, because nobody else at the time when we came into existence was doing it, and it needed to be done. Next slide, please. Thank you. So who founded the archive? I'm going to tell you. Next slide, please. So that's us. That's the dream team. We're the founders. Me, you can see there, and the young woman there is Laura Summers. Both of us were museum professionals. Both of us had MAs in, well, mine was in museum studies and Laura's was in history, if I remember correctly. And the image there of the globe of freedom, you can see that there, it's made out of Wedgwood's black jasper. And that was the last project that I worked on at Nottingham Castle in 2007. And it was around that time that myself and Laura started to talk about we need to do something actively to ensure that Black history is being passed down from generation to generation. And that's when we began to, I guess, plot and plan of developing an archive. Laura stayed with the archive for about just over 2.5 years. And then she moved on to go and work with the Heritage Lottery Fund, and it is still in Heritage in some way, and we still are in contact, and she's a wonderful person. So, so since 2009, when the archive came into existence, you know, with both of us, and then after that, I've been sort of carrying the baton, but hopefully I'll be able to pass the baton on to a young person one day. Next slide, please. How did it happen? How? Next slide, please. This man here, who we saw earlier, Oswald George Powell. I was having a conversation earlier this week with someone that wanted me to work on a project with the Black community. And I said, I know I make it look easy working with the Black community, but it's not easy. You have to have a certain skill, you have to gain trust, and there's a whole range of soft skills that you need to work with the Black community. And it takes time as well. So when Laura and myself had the idea for the archive, and we approached the Black community and we said, we want you to give us your documents and we'll archive them for you. They said no, and they wouldn't. But it was this man, Oswald George Powell, that gave us the first set of documents, and that started the archive off. And with George doing that, he then, I guess, gave the green light to other members of the community. And after that, other people began to donate items to the archive. Next slide, please. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about George. He was like a father figure to me. So George was born in Kingston, Jamaica. He joined the RAF in 1944. He was a radar operator. He was demobilised to Jamaica in 1948, and he returned back to England something like 4 months later. He joined the Communist Party, very political because of what he'd seen in the war. He later joined the Labour Party. In 1963, he was an elected Labour district councillor for Long Eaton. He moved to Nottingham in 1971 and was later elected as a Labour member of the Nottinghamshire County Council. Next slide. A little bit more about George here. So post-war, George worked as an electrician. In the 1970s, he became a math teacher. So one of the very earliest black teachers in Nottingham. The first black teachers was George Powell, Lee Arboyne and John Ray. So he set that example for other black people to become teachers. And I guess it was through people like George that I became a primary school teacher at one phase in my life. He divided his time between political campaigns and advocacy work. George was the man who helped a number of black people in Nottingham with their immigration papers. And so when this hostile environment was cultivated and people were being sent back, well, it's still happening now. The reason why it's not so dire here in Nottingham is because George was the one who helped a lot of people gain citizenship. He played a leading role in setting up the ACNA Centre. The ACNA Centre was the first African Caribbean community centre in the city. And he founded several black political organisations in Nottingham. And all of those documents are within the archive. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, what do we have in the collection? I'm going to tell you. Next slide, please. We have lots of photographs from the 1950s onwards of people settling here in Nottingham, of things like christenings and weddings, and you know, people showing off their front rooms. I'm just going to pause for a minute and say, can you see that little baby girl at the top of the slide there, the white headband on? That's me. I don't know whether you're laughing or not, but that's me. That's me on my christening day. Oh, I'm getting a love heart there. Oh, I'm getting a few. I thought I'd donate something of me to the archive. Oh, I'm getting good. Yeah, that's lovely. So we have photographs. We have lots of photographs in the archive. Next slide, please. And we continue to take photographs. So these are photographs. There are about 48 photographs taken of Windrush women, and these were taken by Keith Piper. So we tried to work with some leading black artists as well, so it gives the archive some status. Next slide, please. We've also worked with Vanley Burke. He's a visiting professor now at Birmingham University, and Vanley Burke has taken a series of photographs of people who worked at Raleigh Industries, and that's a whole other presentation about the Raleigh Industries and how the black community contributed to the economy of Nottingham. Next slide, please. Thank you. We have lots of documents about political organisations and organisations being incorporated. Next slide. And we have lots and lots and lots of black print culture. The very first example of political literature that we have in the archive is the Don't Blame the Blacks, and that was written by George Powell in 1956. And what he tried to do in that pamphlet was set out why there shouldn't be a hostile environment here in Nottingham towards black people. He talked about the history of colonialism in this pamphlet. He talked about the economy in Jamaica at the time, which was really poor and people couldn't make a living. There wasn't no social security or NHS like what you have here in England. So people were really struggling, and he talked about all of that. He talked about class as well as racial discrimination. So that's the very first example that we have in the archive of Black political literature. And it marked the beginning of what would be this growing trend with Black organisations forming and then producing a range of literature to support the work that they do. So we can see there again an example of the Clarion in 1961. And the main concerns at the time was about immigration laws. So there was a lot about, trying to gather support for Black people and to ensure that people could come to this country because they'd served in both wars, and so they could come and earn a living and support their families. It was in the 60s, the late 60s, that I begin to see a difference in the kind of literature being produced by the Black community. And this was through the West Indian Students Association, or WISA. And what WISA did was they began to champion art and education. So it was an organisation that included people who were studying at college, and artists, poets and writers and pianists and so on. It was WISA really championed education, and it was through WISA that they began to support people to go on to further education and higher education. And next slide, please. And the man that you'll see here, if you can see that, Ainsley Dear, he no longer lives in Nottingham, he lives in Jamaica, and he's a scientist. And he's pioneered some innovative work, but I'm not into science, so I'm not going to talk about that, but you can look him up online, Ainsley Dear. Ainsley Dear was the first Black person in the city to go, when I say Black, I mean Black Caribbean person in the city to go on to university. And when he gained his place at Salford University in Manchester, the entire membership of WISA stood up and applauded him for 15 minutes because they knew that one success meant there would be other successes. So, so again, we see a different kind of literature here with WISA. It was really all about art and education, and they made links also with the London-based Caribbean artist movement, where people like Kamal Braithwaite was involved in. Next slide, please. So this is just an example. I'm not expecting you to read it at all, but this is just an example that to show that within the WISA, they call it the magazine. When I talk to people who are still around from the late 1960s, they call it, I would call it a pamphlet because of its size, etc. But they say the magazine. So this is just an example of some of the poetry contained in the WISA magazine. Next slide, please. Now, as we get towards the late 1960s, we begin to see, again, this radical approach, not only in terms of the organisations that are being formed, but also in the content of the literature. So we see, lots of political letters flying about the place to councillors and so on. We see in the centre there is the Spade newsletter, which is all text-based and no images in that at all. And we see organisations trying to organise themselves by having this membership. And the name Spade, it's kind of what's that word? When you it's reappropriating. That's it. It's reappropriating an abusive term that was levelled at the Black community. They thought, actually, you're calling us a spade, but we're actually going to take that and we're going to use that. So Spade was solidarity for protection against deprivation and exploitation. It was also in the Spade newsletter that they did a call out for artists to contribute to future newsletters and magazines Next slide, please. And we can see that happening in the 1970s with the Black People's Freedom Movement that was founded by George Powell. So this is the front page of the Uhuru newsletter. And it's an illustrated poem. And the poem is by The Last Poets, which was an African-American collective. And so we can now begin to see how art and poetry is being used to further the cause for social justice. Next slide, please. There were a number of the Uhuru magazines or newsletters. They produced two different kinds, the A3 size, which was produced on a monthly basis, and then a photocopied A4 size newsletter that was produced on a weekly basis. And these magazines, these newsletters, they contained poetry and illustrations inside them. Next slide, please. I'm going to speed this up. By the time we get to the 1980s, we've gone right back to thinking about art again. And Chroma was the Chronicle of Minority Arts, and they produced 3 anthologies of poetry produced by the Black community. And they also supported younger members of the Black community too. So this is a book that was published by Akira Press, and it's one of the youngest members of the Chroma group, Cheryl Turner, who had a collection of poetry published. Next slide, please. By the time we get into the 90s, we're starting to think about documenting our history. So this is one of the first examples of that, a publication called Lest We Forget, where they're beginning to document the experiences of the World War II West Indian ex-servicemen. Next slide, please. By the time we get into the noughties, it's just happening, it's just more. People are documenting their experiences as Black nurses. People are documenting their experiences of coming to England. People are documenting a whole range of things about their own Black history here in Nottingham. Next slide, please. And of course, we as Nottingham Black Archive, we also produce publications too. So we have a World War II publication, No More Tears for Me and My Mother. The We Will Remember Them publication was done through the AHRC project with Sharon. And we've also produced an anthology of poetry by Black writers in Nottingham. Final slide, I think. Yes, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I would normally say after I've done a presentation, you can email me, but at the moment I'm so engrossed in my thesis that I'm saying, please don't email me. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Panya. That's just a flavour, because I know for sure how much more there is in those archives.
Yes.
And just as we're waiting for some questions to come up via chat or anybody to put their hand up, I think there are a number of things that are really interesting. And perhaps one of the things that you should say is that we re-archived the archive to suit your PhD. So at the moment, it's not really a kind of open archive, is it, that other people could find their way through? But it will be in the future.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I mean, as part of the PhD, I've been given the time to organise it and to catalogue it, which has been really great. But yes, like you say, at the moment, I'm mining the archive, so it isn't open to the public.
What are your favourite things in the archive? What are the things that you think have been either most illuminating or perhaps the most emotive to find? Because this is clearly something you're passionate about.
Absolutely. Can I distinguish? You're asking me to say which one of my children I love the best. I mean, because every time I interact with a different artifact, then, you know, I find more things about it, and it becomes even more interesting. So at the moment, I've really been looking in depth at the Chroma anthology and looking at the poets in that, and that's just got me really, I'm just engrossed in that at the moment. So I mean, just the very fact of how much activism took place in Nottingham during the late 50s, you know, I think that's it's overwhelming to see how many organisations sprang up and how they were trying to tackle injustices in education and in housing and so on. And you know, because when the people from the Caribbean came here, they came here to work for 5 years and then go back. I don't think they had in mind that they would have to become political activists. So, you know, I love it all, I think, in short.